Welcome. My name is Bernard Harcourt, and I welcome you to this panel of the Eric H. Holder Jr. Initiative for Civil and Political Rights at Columbia College on the 2020 elections. This has been a moving target. This was originally titled a debrief, but evidently we're not debriefing so much as figuring out what is going on. You all in the audience surely have been following minute by minute. So no need to recap. I think my last check 2 seconds ago, we're still at 253 for Biden against 214 for Trump, with big outstanding vote tallies from Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina. President Trump's been calling to stop the count, which I don't particularly understand, since if we did that, Biden would win. But there you are. Okay, that's about where we stand right now. It's a moving target. While we're having this panel, it's possible that Pennsylvania is going to be called. So we'll try and keep our eyes on the news and the conversation at the same time. It's an extraordinary panel tonight. And so I'm really thrilled to introduce our four guests, beginning, of course, with Eric H. Holder Jr. Welcome back, Attorney General, Columbia College class of 73, Columbia Law School class of 76. We're thrilled to have you with us so much. Of course, 82nd Attorney General of the United States from 2009 to 2015, and the third longest serving Attorney General of the United States. Welcome. We also have with us Donna Brazile, former chair of the Democratic National Committee and the author of Hacks, the inside story of the break-ins and breakdowns that put Donald Trump in the White House. Donna Brazile, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Donna Brazile is now the founder and director of Brazile and Associates. Before that, of course, she ran Vice President Al Gore's presidential campaign, first African-American woman to serve as the manager of a major party presidential campaign, and has a forthcoming book called For Colored Girls Who Have Considered Politics. So delighted to have you on the panel with us. We also have Neal, who was the former Solicitor General of the United States in the Obama administration, a dear friend and colleague who teaches at Georgetown University Law Center. He's the author of Impeach, the case against Donald Trump. He's also served in the Deputy Attorney General's office as the Justice Department as the National Security Advisor. And if I understand, you were arguing at the United States Supreme Court yesterday on that religious rights and anti-discrimination case, which maybe we can talk to, although we got so much to talk about. But you've been in front of the court 40 times now, so you've got an amazing Supreme Court practice. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for taking the time to join us. And we have Michael Steele as well, who is former chair of the Republican National Committee and senior advisor at the Lincoln Project. When he was elected Lieutenant Governor of Maryland in 2003, Michael Steele made history as the first African-American elected to statewide office. And that was also true, making history as chairman of the Republican National Committee in 2009. So we're thrilled to have you with us, Michael. So listen, we all know we had a massive turnout at this election, record breaking. We've got a race that's pretty tight. We've got a president who is in his usual way acting out. We've got election lawsuits, and it's hard to know what's going to happen in the next days and weeks. But tell us this. What is the single most important takeaway point? I mean, our attention is frayed, right? All of us, we've been kind of like, it's hard to keep focused. We're getting so distracted with everything and with all this news. But what is the single most important takeaway point that you would want someone to know about right now? Eric, can I start with you?
Well, I mean, I think you start with the obvious, and that is, what are the electoral results? And you start obviously with the presidency, although I would also argue that we have to pay attention to what happens down ballot. But maybe not so obviously. I think given what's at stake, given the personalities of the presidential candidates, given the postures of the parties, I think we need to look into these electoral results. I'll be interested to hear, what Michael and Donna in particular have to say. What is this election and results from this election? What does it tell us about our nation? Where are we now as a people? We have, from my perspective, a president who I think could fairly be characterized as somebody who's got race problems, misogynistic, incompetent, corrupt, and yet you've got 45% of the people or so, roughly that, who think that he should get another 4 years. Given all that's happened over the course of these last 4 years, all of the things that are inconsistent with American norms, and I think, who we say we are as a people and what we expect from our leaders, what does that say about the nation? So I think that in some ways is again, I don't want to minimize, the importance of the selection that has actually been made, but I think the things that back up that selection are worthy of examination.
Great, thanks. Thanks a lot, General Holder. I mean, I think that's right. I mean, there's a sense in which this is a referendum in part, a national referendum on these issues that you raised. So let me turn to Donna Brazile, though, and get your immediate take.
While the outcome of the presidential election is still being decided, the one thing we can all agree on is that this nation remains divided. We're divided not only along partisan lines, but the racial divide, the huge gender gap that we just saw with the results of the election, and the fact that we're going to have a divided government. It looks as though Mitch McConnell will retain his majority, albeit a little smaller. Nancy Pelosi will retain her majority, again, albeit a lot smaller. So the divisions in this country did not come to an end on Tuesday, November 3rd. If anything, I think the polarization and the resultant hyperpartisanship will only deepen and worsen. So I believe that the first few days or weeks after the results are all in, and we know the composition of the Congress and the win of the Electoral College, I think it's important that we take a deep breath and look at some of the lessons of 2020. Like 2016, the pollsters did not get it right. And the other problem that we should take a look at is, the type of voting experiences that we saw over the last 6 weeks. We have a lot of work to do in strengthening our democracy, ensuring that we can rebuild trust in the system. But most importantly, I think in the next few days, in the next few hours, we need to constantly reinforce the message that every vote should count. I know I'm going to repeat this maybe once or twice tonight, but so let me just get it off my shoulders right now. In my experience in 2000, serving as Al Gore's campaign manager, that was the most terrifying experience I've ever had in politics. At that moment, it was my 7th presidential campaign, having started at an early age in Louisiana. I had been through a lot of campaigns, both House and Senate campaigns, gubernatorial campaigns, local campaigns, but also at the presidential level. And my famous line, Neal, I think you'll love this, and Eric and Michael, I guess I'm the only non-lawyer in the bunch here. My famous line was that I know how to get out the vote, but I really don't understand all of these rules about counting the votes. Well, I didn't understand all of the different variations of ballots, the swinging Chad, the hanging Chad, and of course the one that I didn't understand, the pregnant Chad, the butterfly ballot. But here we looked at an election on Tuesday where, yes, we had long lines, we had machine malfunction, we had poll workers not showing up on time. But like Florida in 2000, this notion that you gotta count the votes to get the right result. That was the toughest thing to break through, was to get people to be patient. While Vice President Gore told me not to organize demonstrations, and by the way, I was very good at organizing demonstrations, I'm still good. He said, don't do that, don't do it. It's a democracy, it's a democracy. And yet, on the other side, the Brook brothers showed up with their, nice suits and khaki pants, and they start knocking on the doors at the various municipal clerk offices. We were told to let the process work its way through the courts, and the other side was inflaming tensions. I don't forget, I had to call Reverend Jackson, and I had to call John Sweeney at the AFL-CIO and many other civil rights leaders, including Reverend Sharpton, and say, no, we can't organize. We can't, force this to happen. We got to work it through the courts. And of course, on election night, Al Gore called after the Supreme Court, on December 12th, after the Supreme Court made their decision, Al Gore called me, and I was waiting for him to say, let's organize. And he said, shut it down. I said, excuse me? He said, shut it down. We shut it down. And tonight, from the White House, they're stirring it up. I'll leave it at that.
All right, thanks, Donna Brazile. That was a lot of interesting things. We're going to come back to questions about pollsters, and of course, questions about a completely different political attitude towards the process itself. Neal Katyal, welcome. Tell us what you think. Like, what do we have to know right now? The most important.
So I have a bunch of thoughts on these big polity questions that Eric and Donna are raising, but I'm just going to be more mundane right now and just focus on one thing, which is don't be so anxious about the lawsuits that Trump is filing right now. That Trump is no great legal strategist, to put it mildly. I mean, he can't basically win a case in the Supreme Court. I think these cases have three big problems. The first, and this is something that Donna was picking up on, is the theory of them is just fundamentally un-American. It is always a losing strategy in the United States to go into court and say, stop counting votes. And that's why Republicans like, Mike DeWine and others are saying, no, that's not a decent principle. And, if you just think of the contrast right now, Biden is saying count every vote, and Trump is saying toss out every vote that's not for me. On the basis of a technicality. And it looks like gamesmanship. I mean, the comedian Sarah Cooper tweeted today, she said, it's kind of weird that Trump is only seeing fraud in the states he might lose. Is that just a coincidence? And she's capturing something important here, which is his lawsuits are all about only counting votes in the places he's winning. And that contrasts really with Biden's view, which is count every vote, one for me or against me. The second big problem is that these are really tiny complaints when you look at them that Trump has. In Georgia, he's complaining literally about 53 ballots being moved off of one table to another. In Pennsylvania, he's fighting 93 mail-in ballots. And you can always, in any government program, find some irregularities, particularly when you have over 100 million votes cast. And the question is, does it make any difference in any particular state? And this, by the way, is Trump's MO, his modus operandi all the time as president. He's like, oh, one immigrant committed a crime, therefore all immigrants did it. Or one DACA recipient, a dreamer, did this, so therefore they're all violent, or something like that. The difference here is because it's about voting, that's something that everyone in America, or almost everyone this time, has a lot of experience with. We all just did it. We have personal experience, and we know in our hearts that this is an overblown thing when you can only point to 53 or 93 ballots in a given state. And then just the last thing is, even if it makes a difference in one state, does that really matter? I mean, right now, if the projections hold, he's got to run the table and knock out not just one state, but probably two or three through litigation. And that, just to bring back to Donna's point about Bush versus Gore, I was a junior lawyer in Bush versus Gore. I just finished actually working for Eric when he was the Deputy Attorney General. And that was my first time being on a big Supreme Court case. And I think there were two fundamental things that Bush versus Gore had that's the opposite here. One is, of course, Bush was always ahead. And it's just psychologically and the momentum, everything shifts when now you've got Biden really being ahead. And the second is it only involved one state. It was just Florida. Trump's got to more likely than not pick off 2 or 3 states through litigation. Much, much more daunting challenge.
Thanks, Neal. Thanks so much. And I'm going to want to come back exactly to this litigation, the difference between kind of litigation before the count is in versus litigation after the count is in, which seems really important here, and that you put your finger on. But also, what is the longer game, or what are the longer strategies really that are involved here? But before I do, Michael Steele, why don't you give us your most important point?
Thank you. It's great to be with everybody, and it's great to be on this panel with some really high level politicos, and the general and very smart man down at the end there, Neal. So the big takeaway for me is, and you've kind of heard it already, folks. The system worked. It worked, despite Donald Trump and all his crazy. It worked. despite the frustrations of, secretaries of states who were trying to get the resources to deal with an overflow of absentee ballots and vote by mail ballots, the system worked. And you know what made it work? You did. You went to the polls, 101 million before November 3rd, some 40 to 50 million on November 3rd. You made it work. You tuned out the noise, you put your head down, you stood in line, and you cast your vote. Or you called the election board and said, hey, could you send me a ballot? You went online, you participated in democracy. And there are those out there right now who have been working against that from the very beginning. This whole idea of deconstructing our administrative state, which was the signature calling card of the incoming administration in 2016, was to tear it all down, burn it up, protest against it. And we, the people, stood resilient. We marched literally on the day of the inauguration or the day after the inauguration to stake a claim. Millions of women marched and said, wait a minute, we have a different idea. And 2 years later, 100 women showed up as freshman congresswomen. And then 2 years after that, here you are making a change, reinforcing the principles and the ideals of democracy. So my big takeaway for you, and I hope you take this away, is that despite all the machinations of politics and all the drama of Trump and all the noise you hear banging outside of election counting center windows, you made it work. You made it work. And I love the way, it was just, Neal talked about it and the way Donna talked about it and the way the general talked about it, because that's how the system is. It's all these pieces, all these various pieces. And at the center of it is you, the citizen, the voter. And the fact that you cared enough, gave a damn enough to get out and do your civic duty says a lot. They can't undo that. A court's not going to undo that. That was Neal's point. You got to do that, 2, 3, 4, 5 times? That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Donna's experience tells us, when it gets off the rails, there are checks and balances that try their best to get it back on track, to get it back in that democracy lane, And as the governor told you, the general told you, look, this is something that we have control over. So I'm really heartened tonight about where we are. Yeah, we still have some process to do, but I feel really good about where we are. And I'll feel a lot better when it's over, because then I may get some sleep. But that's okay. That's a selfish interest. Donna can appreciate that. She's hanging over at Fox going, what the hell? Where am I? I'm over at MSNBC, slightly more comfortable space. But the reality of it is, we the people still matters. It still works. And I'm very happy for that.
Thank you, Michael. Part of me wants to stop right now, because that was the most uplifting kind of possible way to think about this, and I appreciate it, and I really appreciate it, and I appreciate the soothingness of that too, because a lot of people have been thinking that we've been on the brink, right? And a lot of people are still thinking that we're on the brink in a way, and what you brought to us is this idea that actually, by all of us coming out to vote, we've shown that we can escape that brink. But so we should stop here, but we're not going to stop here, because the question is, are we really past the brink? And to a certain extent, that's what's so frightening, or that's the big question, or that's the elephant in the room. Are we past that brink? And so for my 2 cents, here, and I think Eric, you started off by talking in a way about kind of how this election this year was showing us the soul of America, to a certain extent. And I think that's right. I mean, I think it was a referendum in a way on, and I feel you were sugarcoating it a little bit when you were talking about race problems earlier just now. I mean, the fact is, white nationalism is one of the most powerful political forces in the United States, I think, as evidenced by what we've just been going through over the past 4 years and this election. And obviously it's not new. I mean, it's been driving politics in this country since its inception and since the slave compromises. But what's unique and what, President Trump was uniquely able to do really was to activate that political force, I think, with a certain kind of sixth sense, some kind of animal instinct of always managing to put his finger on the nerve that would push this white nationalism. And it pushed us to what was potentially the brink. Maybe we have passed the brink, but it also pushed us to an extraordinary turnout on both sides. It activated an enormous number of persons who, want to see this agenda continued. Including, the Muslim ban, including immigration bans, children in detention centers, etc. So the question, I take it, is, are we past the brink? And so the question specifically becomes, what else? What could be done to kind of to kind of push us in a less positive direction? On the litigation, I take it, as Neal was saying, it's a lot of post-count litigation that seems unimportant compared to the litigation that took place in the Gore versus Bush was I said pre-count. I mean, right now it's pre-count, but it's different than post-count litigation. So, but there's a larger strategy about that litigation, which is about getting people to believe that it's a rigged election or a stolen election, et cetera. What do you think? Let's start with you, Eric. What do you think? I mean, are we past the brink, or what are the danger? What are the mines? What's the minefield in front of us look like, really?
Well, I think that Michael's right, and I think that is an uplifting thing. That I think our systems have held, and I think it's consistent with what Neal was saying, that in terms of the lawsuits, I don't think we have anything to worry about there. But I think this election has exposed a bunch of things. Our systems have held in significant ways, but our systems have also been misused in the sense that one party has said, we want to keep certain people away from the polls. Another party has said, we want as many people to vote as is possible. These long lines that we saw in African-American communities were an indication of extreme voter enthusiasm, but also an example of the way in which the system has been used by undersourcing it, by doing a whole variety of things to make it more difficult for Black folks to vote. I mean, there's a study I think it was at the University of Pennsylvania that says, you're 7 times more likely to wait an hour to vote if you're Black than if you are white. And that's not chance. That's not simply chance. The destruction of the Voting Rights Act and the Supreme Court case in 2013 really opened the doors. And the Republican Party has taken advantage of the leeway that they have had to put in place a whole series of measures that have made it difficult for certain people to vote. So again, I think, our systems with regard to this election are fine, but our systems are sick in a lot of ways. They are, the protections that we need have been rendered anemic, and we need to think about ways in which we truly, we heal our democracy beyond just, the mechanics of this election. Because I think with regard to this election, we're going to be fine. Whoever the people choose is going to raise his hand on January the 20th. But that doesn't mean that America is well.
Okay, so one of the issues that we need to think about in terms of kind of what this the dangers of the minefields is continued voter suppression or attempts at suppressing the vote, particularly minority votes, and the dangers that would present in the future. There's also this question of the pollsters being wrong or somehow not being able to tap into the sentiment of the country. Donna Brazile, you were talking about that in part. How does that figure in? Is it a reflection that the pollsters really didn't seem to, have a correct picture of what's going on? Does that fit in here with a transformation or something that would present problems in the future?
Well, Michael and I have probably spent more time analyzing polls. I don't want to take anything from Neal and, of course, my good friend Eric, but Michael and I have looked at these polls over the last 30, 40 years. The problem is that the modeling that candidates and campaigns use today is a little bit different than the old polling modeling that says, okay, well, I'm going to go into this part of the country, because my ones are located here and I need to get their temperature. My twos are here and I need to get their temperature, and the threes over there and I might get their temperature. But what if you're a large the electorate? What if there's such a thing called shy voters that back in the day was called the Bradley effect? And that's when Mayor Tom Bradley of Los Angeles ran for governor. And there were white voters who would tell the pollster, oh yeah, I like him, I'm gonna vote for him. And on election day, bang, nothing appeared. So I think, the fact that so much of cable television is driven by the horse race. I mean, there's rarely an opportunity to have a substantive debate. I mean, Michael, when is the last time on MSNBC you had a substantive debate? So the modeling is off. I think the polling firms are aggregating data that just simply don't mirror what might be the election day electorate. And look at this electorate. I mean, had I put together the strategy for this election, I said, yeah, maybe 130, 135,000, because there was a lot of enthusiasm. But God knows I never could have projected this. I mean, 100 million people voting before election day, that's a girl's dream, an organizer's dream. I mean, that would have been touche. Go home and start, lighting up your cigars and drinking, whatever. But no, the modeling is off and we need to try to get it right, because a lot of the disappointment that we see now is that everyone was expecting a blue wave. I wasn't. I mean, 2018 was interesting because after 2016, Democrats were fired up. They flipped those Trump districts, congressional districts, and they just kept moving and moving. I mean, you saw a lot of progress at the state and local level as well. And here comes 2020. I mean, after the Democratic primary, we saw what was going on, right? We saw that there was a lot of enthusiasm. We knew that eventually, once we had a nominee, the party would come together, and then the build up for election day. On the other side, here come Donald Trump. Now, Michael, please.
We lost you, Donna. We lost you. Okay. Let me jump in while Donna's getting sound back. And I'm just going to jump to Michael and then come back to you, Neal, on the.
I think Donna's back.
Oh,
okay.
Did you see me? Am I back?
Yes.
Oh, all right. Al Gore invented the internet, but he didn't teach me much. Look, my basic point is that we're so polarized. 90% of Fox Republicans view Fox. 90% of Democrats and perhaps independents and a little bit in between, they view CNN and MSNBC and a little bit of Fox. And as we well know, social media platforms, I mean, they're driving this. And what Trump is able to do today that I don't think Democrats and the rest of Americans can do, he's driving his narrative online through social media. And if Donald Trump wanted to call a massive march tomorrow, he can get the numbers. Now, it probably will not be as large as his inaugural crowd, but he can get the numbers enough to disrupt whatever. So we need to take a look at not just what happened before in terms of the modeling, get the polling right, the advertising, which I love what the Lincoln Project did, but also get the modeling right in terms of social media and that whole new dynamic where you can enlarge the electorate and you can move people in ways that, quite honestly, those of us who are old-fashioned, we didn't move people that way. We had to actually go out there and reach them and touch them. Today, you can just use this and you can gather all of their strength and enthusiasm.
But yeah, I wanted to talk about the polling, and I'm going to go to Michael because I mean, the problems with the polling reflects that something's going on in this country that raises questions about whether the system worked in a way, or whether we've got some minefields in front of us, right? Because it is the polarization, it is the silence, the unwillingness to confess to, for instance, who you're gonna vote for, and the polarization of those polls that raises a question as to whether or not there's some structural transformation of the political field that means that it's not such a rosy picture in terms of what's coming ahead of us. And I would just say, we had Nate Silver on our last panel with Eric, and we had Nate Silver, and I was complaining about the 2016 polls, and Nate was defending it and saying, what you have to understand, if there's a 15% chance, that means that there's a 15% chance, and that's what happened. And he was really reassuring us. I don't know if you remember, Eric. I mean, this was like 9 to 10 points, right? This is 3 times bigger than the lead that Clinton had, right? I mean, I came out of there feeling really reassured. It was like, we've got 3 times more differential than in 2016. And so I was expecting a bit of a wave. But anyway, Michael, does the polling and the polarization reflect something about a transformation of the political sphere, right? That does raise some worries about what's coming.
Well, Donna put her finger on a very important part of it, because the polling is just off. And there's actually a very fundamental reason why. They don't know where the country is. They, honest to God, don't know. They think the country is the West Coast and the East Coast, and they have this stereotyped view of what's in the middle. And that middle portion knows that. And so they check out. They don't play. They lie, they hide, whatever. They're just not going to engage honestly with the system, because they think seriously that the system is rigged. That when you ask me a question, if I'm a Trump supporter, that you're just going to play me for a fool. And how many of me are in that poll actually? So that's when you get into how it's weighted. And we've already heard in this cycle conversations, at least earlier on over the summer months, how the polling seemingly was weighted or discounted, weighted more towards a particular type of voter and discounting other voters. So if this is the general perception of a lot of the voters out there, how they participate becomes important, to Donna's point. Because the way we would figure that out in the past is, I knock on your door. And when you cussed my behind out, I said, okay, that's not one for us, right? But when this is all you got and you out there texting people, and what do you know? You don't know jack. You don't know nothing. All you know is what pops up on this phone, which is not reality. Do you know that in the state of Florida, Donald Trump got 200,000 more votes in 20 than he got in 16? And nobody saw it coming. You watched an election night, people go, well, yeah, well, that was unexpected. Where in Miami-Dade, where did that Hispanic vote? Come on. Donna will tell you, I will tell you, if you're not out there, and I get the whole COVID piece, and I know how that changed and transformed a lot of how some of this was done. But I can also tell you there are ways in which you can get that information too. The problem is the system has to get where the country is. Right. And it has to put on blinders. In other words, it has to be neutral on everything. It cannot care. It cannot have a preference. It cannot in any way show that it is trying to, get at something in a way that people feel, well, you're not really interested in what I have to say, or you're overstating or over leveraging towards a particular outcome. And so until we're able to actually, until the 538s and all these guys who use tech, and they're really good, I'm not taking away from them, but I'm old school.
Me too.
I still knock doors. I still, I want to
Count
have
flags, count flags.
count the flags. Yes, you want to do that. It's an important part. Yard signs say stuff.
Right.
They mean things.
Right.
And so I think that's a big part of it. And a lot of voters in this cycle, just like 16, didn't see themselves reflected in anything that was being covered on the news. And so when a pollster, if a pollster reached out to them, invariably they say, "Oh yeah, I'm voting for Biden."
Right.
But
I mean,
it's a
there's
safe choice, right?
right, but there's
Safe
also
choice.
the larger question of the polarization and whether that, in fact, is something that is going to put a real stress on the system, right, as we go forward. And let me take that idea and go to Neal. You were saying that that we shouldn't be so anxious about the lawsuits. And I agree. I mean, many of the lawsuits right now are ridiculous or small fry stuff. I mean, and it's also pre-count, which doesn't make any sense. So, but nevertheless, I take it there's a longer game with these lawsuits. In other words, it's not so much about the individual lawsuits and about the 84 ballots here or there. It's a larger game to cast suspicion in such a way either as to do something else that we actually aren't yet even aware of, something about is there a way to play with the delegate counts or something like that, or something between now and the Electoral College, or to get the kind of delay that was the other strategy, right? To get the delay so that it pushes it to the House of Representatives in the states. So even if I agree with you that these cases right now aren't much of a problem, or we shouldn't be too anxious about it, don't you think that this is part of a larger strategy? And what are the minefields there of that larger strategy?
Yes, I do think it's about a larger strategy, Bernard, but I don't think it's about, at the end, the law or the presidency at the end of the day. And I don't think anyone should say Trump hasn't created any jobs, because the man is a one-man jobs creation program for lawyers. And these are lawsuits designed not to keep the presidency for him in the end, because I don't think they can, either pre or post count. It's just the math is too hard. The dynamics are too hard. I mean, his campaign spokesman just went out a half hour ago and said, "Oh, we've put 3 justices on the court and we think Barrett will vote for us." Only if you believe the most corrosive things about the Supreme Court can you think that, this is a plausible strategy. And I don't think that's why he's doing it. I think he's doing it because of 2 things. One, because he's a sore loser and can't help himself. And then number 2, to get to your question, I think because he wants to cast suspicion on the results, not because it's going to keep him from, not because it's going to keep the presidency with him, but because it'll just cast doubt on the system and make it, when he's labeled a one-termer president, he can say that's because the other side cheated or something like that. And in that sense, the conversation we've been having for the last half hour, in a way, feeds a little bit into his whole project here. Because when you think about and you say the system is broken, or we're so worried about this or that, and obviously, I don't mean to be Pollyannish here, and there are a lot of problems, problems like what Eric was pointing to about the poll lines and the like. But at the end of this, I'm still optimistic, because despite all of that chicanery around voting, the system held. I mean, despite the fact the president tried to cheat with the help of a foreign power, the system held. And despite the fact he's got an attorney general who's willing to do anything to help him, and despite the fact that he's lies like candy, and he's now got a media ecosystem with Fox and others to help him do that, still the system held. And despite the fact that even though we've got, it's not just the Voting Rights Act being struck down or the poll stuff that Eric was talking about. I mean, we've got a system, and you, Bernard, and I talked about this 20 years ago when we first met. We've got a system which disenfranchises African Americans who've committed crimes, in massive ways, including, of course, in Florida. And yet still, it looks like we got the result that Biden wins. That, to me, creates a lot of optimism. And just to be hokey for a moment, but I mean it from the bottom of my heart, when I look at someone like Michael Steele, who's been a Republican and stand up for principle and to say this isn't who we are and put the country first, that makes me really optimistic.
All right. Yeah. Me too. Me too. That's really helpful as well. I'm not going to continue to play this role much longer on this panel, being the gray cloud.
Oh yeah, but all right, I'll play gray cloud here, because here's the deal. I think we should be optimistic. I think that we should. We should be happy that the system has held. I'm proud of Michael. That took guts, what he did. And these young people who came out of the Trump administration and who took positions against the administration that they were a part of, who knows what's going to happen to their careers, But they did, the right thing, and I'm proud of them. But boy, we can't be deflected from what we do too well as Americans. And that is facing, those underlying difficult questions, those underlying hard truths. All right, so we can all say that Black folks have been disenfranchised. You guys have been talking about it for 20 years. What have we done about it? What have we done about it?
Yeah.
We can talk about, and to look at it the other way, the way in which nobody has paid attention to folks who are not college educated, don't have wonderful pictures of Columbia behind them on a virtual screen. We've not necessarily done anything for their best interest. And so I can understand the anger, the way in which they feel disenfranchised and how they would glom onto somebody like Trump. What are we doing about that? And so as much as the systems that we have in place have held, there's an underlying body of stuff that we look at, we acknowledge, we write books about, but we don't do anything significant. We don't do enough substantively to make the kind of change that that we ultimately. So America's really great. America's really good, but it could be better. It could be better, and that's the thing that somehow we never. But to be better, it would mean again, hard truths, difficult questions, and we're expert at at avoiding those.
And just to emphasize the Columbia behind you, the whole project of the Eric Holder Initiative is to be working on these issues and to make the world a better place. So hopefully we will.
I'm going to unleash a bunch of young doomsayers on the nation.
Okay, but yeah, bringing us back to the doomsayers. Let me do this though. In terms of kind of my role as gray cloud here, the question is whether there have been whether President Trump, in kind of finding a way to put his nerve on the kind of white nationalism that has really fractured this country again over the past 4 years and risk. Whether it's something that's unique to him, and once he's gone, maybe we're going to get past it and back to more ordinary, less polarized politics, or is it something that's going on in this country that's going to have further repercussions? And one thing I want to throw in here is, assuming that Joseph Biden becomes president of the United States, I assume that Trump, who has broken every single norm that has ever existed or that could possibly have been thought of in terms of politics and presidents, he's broken every single norm. I assume he's probably also going to break the norm that the, deposed president, the no longer president, recedes into the background, into the horizon, takes a bit of a retirement, doesn't get too involved in politics, doesn't create a lot of trouble for the next president, which is a norm that has existed in this country. I assume he's not going to follow that. He's not going to follow that script, right? So I assume we're going to be getting, in fact, should Biden prevail, we're going to be getting a very vocal kind of opposition, and still this kind of the continuation of all these Twitter screeds and whatnot, and that could kind of have some repercussions in terms of the future of politics. Anyone want to take that one
Well,
on?
just
What do you
real
think?
quickly, and I'll let this somebody else answer the question. I saw something today on, I don't know, Fox, someplace I was dialing through, and they're already talking about a quote resurrection project, which means Trump is going to run again in 2024. So recede into the background. We already have what you're talking about, Neal, and then it's resurrection project. So I'll leave that to the other panelists.
Michael, you want
I think the critical question, because we talk about Trump picking at a scab, a wound, and putting his finger on a particular nerve, et cetera. For me, it begs the question: why does that happen? How is that allowed to happen? And why is he able to do that? He's able to do it because it's a real part of America. Mm-hmm. It's a real part of 401 years in this country that we've not dealt with. We've danced around it. We've marched against it. We've talked about it. We've, zoomed on it, but no one's really gotten their hands dirty in it. A lot of good patriots have died in this onward march of trying to deal with race. And yet as a country, we still struggle with it. The reason white nationalism works is because it's always and always has been a real vein in this country. We've never sliced into the vein and cut the blood flow of it. We still see generation after generation of whites in this country being raised in that environment. I mean, when you come out of the womb, you're not a racist, baby. You are taught that. You are exposed to that. And so that's where we have to get into a lot of this. You dress it up. We don't burn crosses and see burning crosses anymore. We see tiki torches. They're not wearing hoods, they're wearing khakis. But the message is the same, the vibe is the same. And so we have, a generation or two, since the marches on Washington, since the riots and the water hoses and the police dogs, what do they see now? They see a cop with his knee on the neck of a black man for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And so how do they process that? How does a white kid process that? How does a black child process that? And so what Trump is able to do is to dismiss it. What did he say about George Floyd? Seriously, what national speech did he give to quell the rage in the black community and to help the white community understand the pain that we were feeling?
Well, he told the Proud Boys to stand by, is what he did, right?
There you go.
Explicitly.
So if that's what the leader of the country is doing, how does that get pushed down and pushed out into the broader neighborhoods and communities across the country? You still have people white folks in this country never had to deal with black people, except for what they see on television. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's part of, for me, a big part of how we get on the other side of this. You're exactly right. Joe Biden is going to have his hands full, not because of COVID-19 or the economy trying to come back, but because Donald Trump is going to be a former president tweeting the hell out of him every day.
Right.
So
Go ahead, Donna.
I have 2 points. The last week, someone knocked on my door, and of course, I'm like, drop it off and leave. But this was a man who is part of a construction team that's replacing all of the electrical poles in my neighborhood. So I'm like, and he wanted to come in, and I'm not afraid, I know, but it was the middle of the day, and I figured my neighbor next door was looking because he's always Zooming as well. So I put my mask on. I have my little dog who I thought, well, if all goes bad, she'll kill him. Well, the guy, we were talking, and I said, where's your mask? And he's like, oh, I don't believe in that. I had a long conversation about trying to inform him about COVID and what the dangers, the experience I've seen with my family, my friends, how many people have died. And I said, at the end of the block, that man died. And I was trying to scare him into like, you want a mask? No. I realize it's hard for people to understand, but Trumpism is real.
Yeah.
I'm on Fox. It's real. I made the decision to do Fox. And on election night, I called Michael. Michael you and I communicated like 3, 4 in the morning. Then we talked at 7 or 8.
Yeah.
I mean, we didn't go to bed. Because I have to call and cleanse some of this stuff. And Michael is probably the only person who would take my call at that hour. And I'm like, one of my colleagues came on the air and started talking about defunding the police, law and order, while, he said DC is shut down, New York is shut down because of those people. And I did everything in my power because I knew Donald Trump was watching, and had I responded, I would start trending. I don't want to trend when Joe Biden is still getting out his votes. So I'm sitting there and I said to myself, damn, defunding the police, law and order. The divisions that are out there in the country, they are like sprouting like weeds. People are feeding off of the divisions. They're feeding off this false narrative. They're feeding off of Trumpism. Trumpism is real. It will not be dismissed. We should not just start calling them names the way we're calling names. If we don't deal with, as Eric said earlier, some of these underlying problems, the social economic condition. I'll never forget in 2016, I would tell my good friend Robbie Mook, Robbie, what are we doing with white people? Robbie, what are we doing with white people? I know I look Black. Yes, I'm a female, but I'm also Irish. What are you telling white people? Because if we're not talking to white people, we're going to lose a lot more white people and a lot of college educated white people. So Trumpism is real. We need to deal with the underlying issues, but at the same time, we need to do it in a respectful way, because they don't get Black Lives Matter. They don't get the fact, Eric, that when you put your knee on someone's neck and he's crying for his mama, his last dying words is to call for his mama. If we can't get them to understand, we don't want to be shot in our bedrooms while we're sleeping. You come banging on my door. If we can't get them to see this, as one of my friends said, all right, just go back to calling me the N-word and stop being a racist. Just stop it. I knew this is something that we have to deal with, because Trumpism is real and it's tearing the fabric of our democracy.
Yeah. Now, there's no doubt it's real, and there's no doubt that it's reactivating, re-energizing a scab, a sore conflict that has always existed with us, as Michael Steele was saying, and that's why projects like Brian Stevenson's project down in Montgomery, Alabama, with the lynching memorial and the whole legacy museum and all of the work that he's doing to kind of make us face history in that way is so important, and change the narrative of that history, and the work that's being done here at Square One, the Justice Lab, and other places that tries to work on understanding, properly understanding that history is so important. And there's this odd way in which President Trump has managed to really bring this to the fore, right? I mean, and listening to Biden, when he gave his speech two days ago, I think it was 2 days ago. I'm getting my days confused now. Maybe it was yesterday, where he spoke about, I campaign as a Democrat, but I would be president as an American. It was that more normal political discourse that we were used to before President Trump, that in a way is soothing. But what these past 4 years and this election has done is really to kind of expose. Not just polarize, which I think obviously it has done, but also expose. Yeah. Something that stays hidden when it's covered with the ordinary, ordinary politics, I'm just governing, et cetera, the norms. So So, I don't know if that's the silver line. Now I'm from gray cloud onto the silver lining, but I mean, I don't know if that's the silver lining of this horrible experience that we've had over the past 4 years and that we're confronting right now. Yeah, back to you, Eric, on this.
Well, it's interesting. I think that in some ways we can, we can learn lessons from the Trump years that are maybe not good for us as a nation, but could be good for political parties. The traditional notion is that you get elected and then you reach out, and you kind of try to increase the size of the number of people who support you by getting people on the other side. And I think their philosophy has been, no, all we want to do is grow. We have substantial numbers of people on our side who don't necessarily vote. And so we want to make sure that we get more of them, to the polls. And if both sides ultimately decide that's a way to do this, then you're not reaching across. You're not trying to come up with bipartisan, nonpartisan solutions. You're just trying to energize your base, and that's a pretty frightening prospect. That's not the way we traditionally have, or at least traditionally said the way in which we have done these things. But in some ways, the Trump presidency and the fact that he came damn close. I don't think he's going to win, but he came damn close in the electoral college. Although he's going to get destroyed, I think, in the popular vote. And as long as we've got an electoral college, we got to deal with that, with that reality. But if that means that the party is going to just retreat, to their own sides and just try to increase, the numbers of people that they have from their own side and try to win elections that way, I wonder what does that mean for for the future of the nation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Neal, do you think that how do you think the Supreme Court's going to fit in here in terms of this polarization, kind of in terms of the future of America in a way, really? Because it seems as if it was at the center. It became the center of of the polarization with the Barrett nomination and replacing Ginsburg. So how do you think the Supreme Court is going to fit in this going forward?
I think it's a really hard challenge for the Supreme Court and for the Chief Justice in particular, who really does, he's a student of history. He really cares about the legacy of the court, about keeping it a strong institution. I mean, he reveres Chief Justice Marshall. It's just palpable. And yet you've had really three kind of episodes at the court. You've had, or I think three recent ones. You've had Merrick Garland and all the things that happened there. You have the Kavanaugh hearing, and then you've had the Barrett situation being rushed through the way she was. And so, and the result of that is a very, very conservative Supreme Court, certainly more conservative than any in our lifetimes. And you'd probably have to go back to 1935 to find something similar. So that poses a real challenge to an institution that's supposed to be for all Americans. And, the worry is it going to become like the other institutions in our government, which have become, as Eric was saying, if you're the president, you just cater to the base, or if you're in the Senate majority, then you cater to your base or whatever, and you rush things through. And the court should be operating on a very different plane, but it's going to be hard for it, I think, over time to resist some of the same coarsening of the discourse that happens in America. And I do think, this is where this election to me was so important, not as a Democrat or, anything like that, but just because to have as our next president, someone who actually respects the rule of law, who respects institutions, who's not going to sit there and say, these are my justices. If he sets that tone, hopefully the court can take a little bit of that tone too, and take that lead and resist what Trumpism has tried to do in pushing the Supreme Court in a certain direction. Trump certainly didn't succeed in that project. I mean, just look at the tax returns case, which involved him and his own, he lost unanimously, including by his own appointees. So I think the court has held so far. But I think, we've avoided this, assuming that projections are right, we've avoided, I think, what could have been a more severe threat to the court with more years of Trumpism.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But how do you respond to the kind of the reaction, which is, wait a minute, it feels as if, every time we've got, someone like Trump in office, that they're really into, pushing this court in an extreme way. And then when you've got the other side and they're into being conciliatory and trying to return to normal and spend so much time with this normal politics and normal court behavior that, you end up with a great skew at the end of the day with such a conservative court. It's kind of like, you're faced with the Federalist Society and you're playing, I don't know, you're going to the ballet or something.
Right. No, I agree with that. I think the Democratic Party has sucked on judges. I mean, just been horrible. They've never gotten their act together. They never cared about it. Maybe it goes back to Roe versus Wade and the fact that conservatives were energized for many years because they understood how dangerous courts could be to their project. But we've just never understood it. We've been totally complacent. And as a result, you've got a very lopsided situation. Of the last 19 justices nominated to the Supreme Court and confirmed, 15 are by Republican presidents, 15 of 19. That isn't a court that looks like America or represents America. And so fundamentally, I think the Democratic Party has to change and actually care about this instead of, trading it away for, a favor to a senator here or there.
But you know what? I think the problem's actually.
Go ahead, Eric, then Michael, then Donna, I think.
I think the problem's actually larger than that. I think what Neal said is right, but that's a part of it. The deal is, I think that Democrats and progressives are uncomfortable with the acquisition and use of power.
Thank you.
And that is something that Democrats and progressives have got to get over, because the reality is, the Mitch McConnells of the world, there was no principle involved with Merrick Garland and Barrett. It was all about the use of power. Yeah. And to the extent that we can acquire power, we should do it. And then we should use that power, again, in appropriate ways. Doesn't mean you have to do anything wrong, but you should not feel uncomfortable about seeking to acquire power and then using it.
I'm hearing an amen from Donna and also from Michael.
I want to start singing hallelujah, but I don't want to mess up anybody's vocals. Now, Eric is absolutely right. I mean, I've spent my entire life fighting just to get folks to, first I fought to get voting rights because I thought that was the important thing. I've fought to expand the participation of people because I thought that was right. And then once you get people in the White House, they try to do the right thing. And you see Republicans come in, and no offense to anyone who's a Republican, but they come in and they exercise power. It's raw. It's theirs. I mean, seeing a sitting president hold a campaign event at the White House, his rally speech, his "I'm doing well" speech, and then just the other night, his victory party speech. I mean, they know the line and they're not afraid to go over it. And it's weakening our institutions. And I just hope that if Democrats are able to seize this moment, they will use the power that the people have given them in 6 out of the last 7 presidential elections. Use some of this power.
So can I pick up real quick there? Yeah, so there is, and this is the important distinction of what Donna and Eric just said. There's a difference between the use of power and the abuse of power. And what you have seen in this president, especially during this political season, is an abuse of power. Knowing where the line is and not giving a damn about crossing it, because who's going to challenge him? And so that's an abuse. To the underlying point, though, about the Supreme Court, and I have to tell you, as national chairman, I couldn't figure out what y'all were thinking. I was like, y'all don't get what this race is about. This is not about the environment, okay? This is not about healthcare. This is about the federal court system and the Supreme Court. And I can tell you where it started. Roe versus Wade was the catalyst, no doubt. But the Bork nomination was the moment when Republicans says, oh, okay, so that's how y'all going to use your power. Okay, all right, okay, gotcha. And that was the first launch, and the way we see it on the Republican side is That's the first time the Democrats abused power with respect to the nomination of a Supreme Court judge. And whether that's right or wrong in that view, doesn't matter. It's how we saw it. And everything has, from that to Coney Barrett, has been, you can track it, you can trace it, and you can see exactly how Republicans almost in some sense kind of devolved into madness around the nominating process for Supreme Court justice. But that's really how we saw it. Roe versus Wade was the animating, where there was the court stepped in and imposed a political decision on a case that a lot of conservatives at the time and a lot of Republicans at that time didn't think was ripe, R-I-P-E, ripe for judicial action. The states were still trying to figure it out. We can get into that history. But then the crowning touch was the Bork nomination. And here we are. So I don't know how you unring that bell. How do you, I don't know, Eric, how do you unring that bell? You know, Neal, you're before the court almost every week, if not sometimes twice a week. How do you unring that bell with the Supreme Court?
I think it's really hard. And as I say, I do think who the president is will matter. It sets a certain tone. But one real problem is it's not just the Supreme Court, it's all the lower courts that Trump has really packed, including with a lot of ideologues. And so that is the raw material that comes up to the Supreme Court. And when that raw material is so skewed in a particular way, that's also going to affect the way the court thinks about issues. And so the consequence, if it is the case that the Democrats don't have a majority in the Senate and they can't expand the size, not necessarily the Supreme Court, but the lower courts, which have been, skewed out of whack now by the Trump administration, is really going to be, it's going to be a real challenge for this court. I do think that this Chief Justice has the temperament and skill to try and navigate a lot of this in a way that very few individuals do have, but it's a real challenge.
Eric, did you want to say something in response to this?
Actually, I wanted to ask Neal a question. I mean, I tend to agree with you about Chief Justice Roberts, but when you're now faced with a 6-3 court, how much influence, you'll know better than anybody, how much influence does a Chief Justice have in trying to guide the institution? It's one thing when it's 5-4 and he can be a swing vote. He might, you could have 5 conservative justices say, hey, we heard you, that's very good. We're going this way. How much of an impact can he actually have on a 6-3 court as opposed to a 5-4?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know because, we haven't really been in this situation. And I think it depends a lot on who the chief is. I mean, if it's Warren Burger, I don't think it's going to be much. But John Roberts is kind of the opposite of that. He really, as before he got on the bench, he was the best Supreme Court litigator of his generation. He just has an enormous credibility in that building, and maybe that will be enough, and maybe it won't. And we certainly all, I think, need to do things to help. And that means, for example, funding litigation teams and getting attention out there and generating some of that raw material on the other side, even if we can't always win it in the lower courts. If the arguments are all out there and developed as best they can be, I think that's part of it. Part of it is a political strategy to call attention to when these lower courts really do outrageous things. And we've certainly had some recent examples of that are just, mind-blowing, that you can't even imagine that a federal judge would say. So there are things to do, but ultimately, I think the best solution is going to be trying to win the Senate and do some more structural reform.
I have a little news. I hear that Georgia is within 4,000 votes.
So which way? Which way is that going?
It's trending toward Biden as more Fulton and Cobb and Gwinnett come in. It's Donald Trump lead is now less than 4,000.
Okay.
Bernard, can I give a quick little story to back up what Eric just said about the Chief Justice? Yeah. So, and because I think he's got his finger on the correct pulse about how this could potentially play out. So we all remember the Kavanaugh hearings, right? And how that kind of turned out, and how Kavanaugh really went political. He's just like, I don't care if I am a judge, I'm going political. So from some pretty well-placed sources, I understand that after the swearing in and Kavanaugh gets there, the Chief Justice at some point called him into the office and said, "We do not do that here." So, yeah. So I think because of what both Neal and Eric have said about the temperament of this Chief Justice regarding the institution, and how he really has this strong feeling about keeping out of the game of politics. I think he, in terms of that 6-3 question, I think he could probably convince some of those justices. And that goes to the second point. I'm not buying this whole thing, and this is a mistake that a lot of Republicans make when they appoint some of these folks. They're not these rabble-rousing, hard-edged conservatives. That's certainly not what Kavanaugh's temperament has been. I mean, I've been in circles with him here in the Washington area. That's not that guy. And neither are, I don't know that much about Coney, but neither are some of the others. So I think there's going to be some very disappointed conservatives out there who think that suddenly this court is going to, give move off of family questions around gay marriage and, repeal Roe versus Wade. I think because of the way the Chief Justice views the institution, could have some slightly different outcomes for them.
All right, great. Well, let me do this. We could continue. One day Eric, we'll have to have another panel on the Supreme Court now that it's changed composition so much.
Right.
We had a great one on the Supreme Court a couple of years ago. But let's get to some of the questions from the audience, from the attendees and participants, and some of my colleagues. So I've got a question from Professor Robert Yale Shapiro, who's the Wallace Sayre Professor of Government and Professor of International Public Affairs here at Columbia. And the question goes as follows. So how does a Biden administration fight the uphill battle he will face with a weakened Democratic House and presumably also a Republican-controlled Senate? To deal with the coronavirus and the economy, avoid a disaster in the making for the Democrats for the midterm elections 2022, and also prevent McConnell from making this a one-term Democratic administration. So basically, how does a Biden administration deal with the weakened Democratic House and presumably also Republican-controlled Senate? Who wants to start? Who wants to start with that?
I'll take it real quick.
Okay.
Just real quick on that. I think the one thing that people are kind of overlooking here about a Biden administration is that he was a senator first. He knows these people. He has spent time in the room with them. They know him. And to be quite honest with you, a lot of Republicans in the Senate like Joe Biden. They've worked with him. They have teamed up with him on various bills in the past. And so I think that works to his advantage. Unlike President Obama, who had been in the Senate for about 18 months and not really had time to really develop that relationship, particularly with Republicans in the Senate, Joe Biden has been there. And if you don't know anything about Washington, you need to know this. It is all about the relationship. It is all about the relationship. Because if you don't have that, you got nothing. You can't move a dime across the street. It just doesn't happen. So I think that there's going to be a lot more success for Biden in terms of negotiating on big items like healthcare, certainly on infrastructure, and especially on COVID-19. So I think, maybe that's my, Pollyannish view of it, but I think he's going to have a little bit more runway working with senators, despite the closeness of the majority in the Senate and some of the hostilities from the past.
Okay, great. Donna, you want to jump in?
Well, I agree with Michael. I think infrastructure is one way because both parties believe that this is something that needs to happen. I think if in this lame duck period, if the president who said after the election he would go back to the negotiating table, if they can take that package and get it through before the January 5th, the new Congress is sworn, and I think that'll take some pressure off of Biden. I also think any other COVID relief stuff, which is include national testing and tracing that Joe Biden has called for. If all of that can be done before January 5th, then he will be in a position to focus on healthcare, because healthcare was a driving issue for the Democratic base and the Democratic Party. And we don't know what's going to happen with the Affordable Care Act that's going before the court. I don't know nothing about the legal system. I also think that this is an opportunity for the vice president to, in addition to infrastructure, put forward something on lowering the prescription drug prices. The Republicans will probably go back to being fiscal conservatives again.
Yeah.
This is a drinking game when you talk about that. They'll go back to being fiscal conservatives. And so I assume that they're going to try to put the brakes on some of the other investments and initiatives that the vice president and Kamala Harris ran on. And that's going to be a big tension within the Democratic Party, et cetera. So the last part is that regulations. I mean, the Trump administration, and again, I defer to you lawyers, they've been busy overriding everything that Barack Obama did. And I think Joe Biden is going to have to go back and look at the Book of Regulations, and to reinstitute some of those regulations and take some of the Trump craziness, this thing about this one on racism and conferences and intersectionality.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that is, so look, I think
never done so much for critical race theory right there.
No. But I agree. I think Joe Biden, because of who he is and what this moment will call for, I think he will have a longer runway. And I would hope that the party will be mindful of what happened after 2008 and what took place in 2010, although this will be, again, a different kind of electorate and a different kind of election. So I think, but overall, I'm just impressed that Joe Biden has a really good, competent team around him. And trust me, I know the difference between competence and incompetence.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the kind of the flip side of the coin of Professor Shapiro's question really is, is not just the worry about, how do you do it with a Republican-controlled Senate, but the worry that you're going to spend so much time. I mean, so much time is going to have to be spent just kind of like putting things back together again that, have been completely dismantled. And so, it's hard to imagine reaching forward and creating new things, new institutions, new programs, et cetera, when so much of the work is going to be just this reparative, like, okay, man, these regulations are now completely mauled. We got to, sew them up away.
And that's what the transition is for.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
But,
Go ahead, Eric. Yeah.
I think that, Biden now faces a different set of problems. If the election had gone as pollsters told us, he would have had to deal with, a Senate, a Democratic Senate, an enhanced Democratic majority in the House, and a restive, progressive component on the Democratic side to be pushing really kind of transformative things. All right, so now the power is not there to do those kinds of things, and now I think he's got to focus, as Michael has said, on, and Donna, you got to figure out ways in which he can work with the Republican majority. And I do think that, given that reality, he's probably the best person we could have be the Democratic president at this point. That history that he has with them and his ability, hopefully, to work with these people. Though I wouldn't sell that too much. Mitch McConnell may have a drink with him and, put his arm around him. And once he leaves, says, yeah, we're going to make him a one-term president. We're not going to make him a successful president. We're going to, whatever we do, we're going to kill Kamala Harris in the crib, whatever. All with an eye towards what happens in 2024. But I don't think, the transformative things, judicial court reform, the question of that voting rights bill, the John Lewis voting rights bill. I'm not sure. I see a path to that now without having Democrats in control of the Senate and of the House. On the other hand, there's a lot of executive action that he can take to undo this kind of mindless anti-regulation stuff. And I hope, hopefully they'll do that. Getting back into the Paris Climate Accords. There's a whole range of things that he can do simply because he's president.
Mhm, mhm.
I mean, to me,
And
like day one, he comes in and should presumptively say everything Trump did in terms of regulation or executive order, we're flipping, and that should be the presumption. And then keep anything that there's a good argument over the presumption. But that to me is the place to start.
Mhm, mhm. I've got a connected question by Olivia Choi, who's Columbia College 23. So 2023, that makes Olivia a sophomore, I think. And she's asking, in relationship, what do we make of the lack of Democratic gains in the Senate? And how could the current Senate shape Biden's presidency? So we've talked a little bit about, Eric, you were just talking about the way in which a Republican Senate could shape the Biden presidency. But what do we make of the lack of Democratic gains in the Senate? Who wants to take that one on?
I leave that one to the political folks because at this point,
All right, Michael and Donna. All right, yeah.
I'll let Donna take the first bite at that apple because that's on her tree.
Okay, all right. Go ahead.
First of all, I'm assuming that by January 5th, we might know the results in Georgia. It looks as though it's tightening up also in the Purdue versus Ossoff. Look, Chuck Schumer went out there. He picked the candidates that he wanted, with one exception, the state of Tennessee. He raised the biggest amount of cash I've ever seen in a senatorial period. Possibly up to $2 billion in advertisement. Between Amy McGrath and Jamie Harrison, let's just be honest, they spent $200 million to defeat Lindsey Graham and, of course, Mitch McConnell. So what happened? The polling modeling was terribly off. The only two places that we know so far, well, three, Arizona and the Scott versus McSally race.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, if you Cory Gardner versus John Hickenlooper, but Joni Ernst, who was underperforming Donald Trump in Iowa. She was underperforming after she didn't know the soybean question. She blew away her competition in the closing days of the campaign. And look at Bullock. Bullock was gaining on Daines. It was very competitive, and boom. And Sullivan versus what I call the Dr. Bear in Alaska. That's an interesting race because he's an independent who's basically a Democrat. Again, a race that nobody put any attention to, but a lot of money. And again, election day, Democrats really saw some of these races almost at 49, 50%. And then here come election day, and it caters. So look, Cunningham, we knew he had some problems. He didn't keep his candy in the wrapper. And as a result of that, he faced 2 weeks of just negativity. But yet, look, that's a close race. And of course, Mark Warner, and all of the other Democratic incumbents, with the exception of Jones, swept in. I think, again, our modeling is off. The Trump people had a theory of the case. They enlarged the electorate, and you don't have to enlarge the electorate by millions of people. You can do 35,000. You can register enough people in a given election cycle and target them with mail phone calls and a few door knocks, and you can maintain some of the energy and can win at the down ballots. And look what happened in Michigan. All night I was worried that Gary wouldn't pull it off.
Well, Donna, do you think that the polling just gave us false hope? Because I went into election night thinking, I thought Biden was going to win and that he was going to. The only question was, what was the size of the Democratic majority going to be in the Senate? And we're not going to do that. And that was,
Eric, when our side continued to spend $6-7 billion on running the same stale kind of campaign, not dealing with what's actually happening in those districts or those states. Good. And the fact that these candidates are coming at the electorate from 37,000 feet, and you're not knocking on doors, you're not creating excitement, you're making people pay $35 for a damn yard sign. And I'm sitting here at 60 years old saying, where are the sound trucks? Hell, you can stay in the car and put some boogie music to keep people in line. Some things don't change in politics, even during a pandemic. And I think that their modeling was totally off. Trump knows how to bring people out. The guy is a wizard. He's a salesman. And his base came out for him, and they helped those senators. And remember, this law and order message and what they were able to, the way they were able to weaponize race in some of these areas, the extremely difficult misinformation, well, I call it, it was lethal, the misinformation campaign. It was difficult. I mean, look at it, look at the results. Just go ahead and look at the results and see what's outstanding, and look at how the dynamics of race. And you also had this notion that Biden was going to shut down the economy because he was demanding that people wear a face mask. The misinformation was lethal. And we didn't address it because we don't do influencers. We're not doing door knockers. I said, well, you could do COVID conscious door knocking. Because people, Eric, I don't know about you in your neighborhood, I got more door knocks and literature for these DC candidates. In fact, I don't know what to do with all this material.
Right.
People understand that you still got to do old-fashioned gut licking, shoe licking politicking, and you just can't depend on ads.
Right. All right. Well, we're actually past our schedule here right now. So I've got a bunch of great questions from our students: Ailey Hu, CC 24, and Sydney Scott, CC 21, and Michael Gardner and Riley Smith, Columbia College 22. So unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to these questions because we've gotten to the end of this panel.
I can take one or two as a professor at Georgetown. Come on, I got to show the love. You
want to? Okay, all right. Let's take a couple of these really quickly on the responses, and then we'll wrap it up. Ailey Hu, who's Columbia College 24, says, what do Republican elected officials think of Trump's claims that widespread electoral fraud led by Democrats is stealing the election away from him? Will any stand up to Trump? Well, I think, Michael, that's one's maybe.
Yeah, they don't believe it's true, and no, they will not stand up to him.
Oh, oof. Okay. Ouch. All right. Well,
yeah, that was short.
Sometimes. Wait a minute. You're supposed to be my sunshine here.
No, I mean, look. I mean, you had a number. You had Chris Christie and a few others come out and say that every vote needs to be counted, but they never directly confronted the president. So.
All right. Okay. I've got another one from Michael Gardner. Do you see a Biden administration, even with some of the Trump-packed lower courts, going after some of the voter intimidation that's been going on, or going after some of the white supremacist militias like the 3%ers or the Oath Keepers? Eric, that one's for you, I think, and maybe Neal.
Yeah, I would think that a new attorney general, even with a Voting Rights Act that has been crippled. There are statutes and there are people in the Civil Rights Division, the Voting Rights Section, that are anxious to get out into the field and do what Justice Departments and Civil Rights Divisions have always done. So yeah, I would expect to see a lot more from a Biden Justice Department than we've seen over the last couple of years.
100%, my nonprofit at Georgetown ICAP, we have a whole playbook and we've been suing all these militias. We would just give it over to the federal government, to the Justice Department, and they can use it to stop voter intimidation. And then I do think we shouldn't give up on the idea of a new Voting Rights Act. I mean, it was the Voting Rights Act in 2006 passed unanimously in the Senate, 98-0, and it was like 421-3 in the House. And so I think we need to fight like tooth and nails to try and get the John Lewis Voting Rights Act passed.
Can I just real quick on that one? I could not agree with Neal more. You know what the difference between what Bush did and what we have right now is Bush cared, and they don't right now. And so now this is a little bit of guerrilla warfare. I mean, to go where we're talking about before, how we do strategy and we know how to use the power. Here's some power that I think the Democrats can use on this particular issue. Embarrass the hell out of them, because the reality of it is, if the president of the United States and folks like me and others around the country are saying every day, you need to do this bill, right? That pressure is going to grow. I mean, you have relationships in Washington, that's one thing. The other thing they don't like in Washington is pressure. They don't like pressure from outside of the confines of Washington, D.C. And so there's a strategy there in which this can work. And I think it's something that should be considered, because right now there's no pressure because Senate Majority Leader put it in the drawer.
Right.
President's not going to talk about it.
Yeah.
Right. All right. One last question then quickly. On the polling issue, do you think it's a matter of information warfare meant to create overconfidence and a lack posture on the other side? In other words, do you think that something about the polling is strategic? The mispolling is strategic, or the results as a way to keep people, I mean, in other words, do you think like did it have this effect of actually making, Democratic voters less worried because all of a sudden they thought there was going to be a blue wave, right? Anyone think that there's any
I think I got where you're going. Just real quick on it. That requires a level of strategery I just don't think exists in the polling community.
Okay.
I think what happens is it takes a few seeds of bad information, and to Donna's point, a few seeds of bad practice that you just, this worked the last time, we'll try it again. And when it didn't work the last time, you said, we'll tweak it at the edge instead of just actually looking at why it didn't work the last time. But I don't get the sense from the pollsters I know that there is this sort of concerted effort, even from the partisan pollsters, right? They may try to, write their questions and frame their questions to their particular, audience a certain way to elicit a particular response. That's an art to do that, to be able to do that. But there's no malice there. There's no real kind of strategy. We're going to ask these series of questions, and it's going to drive people to think of and look at this election a certain way. At least I haven't seen that. I don't know, Donna, in your experience.
I also think that it's not in their long-term interest.
Right.
If Charlie Cook is wrong, if Nate Silver's wrong, if Nate Cohn's wrong, 538's wrong, if they're wrong, that's not good for business. If they're just proven to be wrong 4 years ago, this year, they poll and do other things, I'm sure, beyond just the political, and their brand gets tarnished. So I don't think there's a strategic use of pollsters to give out false information.
Right.
I think they
just remember, look, think about SurveyMonkey and all these other polling firms that, go to people online. First of all, I never do online polls. You're not getting into my business, okay? But we have a digital divide. We have many communities that are not even connected, let alone have enough bandwidth to spend 35 or 37 minutes filling out this stuff. So we're missing people. So you have to combine polling with actual evidence. We have to go back to making sure we can do both. Technology is beautiful, don't get me wrong. I have all of my jazz on my iPad. I love it. All right. But at the same time, if you don't have those relationships, if the polling firm is a national firm and not working with state firms and statewide firms, then you're missing something. You're not getting the total picture. And, the media just hungers for numbers, because you can take a number, number 2, and let's make a story. Mm-hmm. But 2 + 2 or 2 - 2 is a shaping of a narrative. And so these polls and shaping narratives are things that when Eric, you write up all of the list of things we have to reform it if we're going to strengthen our democracy.
Yep. All right, good. And on this polling question, I really do think that if you get back to counting lawn signs and flags and whatnot, I did notice in a lot of areas kind of the far more Biden signs than there had been Clinton signs, in contrast to the Trump signs in a lot of in rural areas as well. But okay, all right, okay. So like usually, either I give some closing remarks or Eric gives some closing remarks. But this time, and I know if I were to, it would be all about the worry about white nationalism. So we don't want to hear about that. I really liked Michael Steele's "The System Worked." So I'm going to give the last word. Can I hear that again? Can you say that again? That's so,
make us feel good, Michael.
Soothing. All right. So first, I want to thank everybody again. I just want to remind you, since our founding, and the documents that sort of encapsulated those moments, the most important words of all the words written are three: we, the people. It's not we, the government, not we, the institution, we, the secretary of fill in the blank. It's we, the people. And it sets out some very important principles about those three words, set out important principles about who we are and what we mean to each other, and why, even to this day, even with a president that, you know, we scratch our head about, there are people who still want to come here. There are people who still want to raise their families here. There are people who really want to discover their dream and make it an American dream here. And that's something we can't lose sight of. We, the people. I tweeted out something earlier today in which, you know, I wanted to make it very clear that this ain't about one person. George Washington, right, made it very clear this was not about one person. Donald Trump tried to prove him wrong. We, the people, proved otherwise. And that's the power of the moment we are in this history of this great nation. All the problems we've had, all the issues around race and economies and all of that, at the end of it, you cut through all of it, three words. That's what makes it work. And that's why what you did on Tuesday matters.
Brilliant. Great. Good. I got that feeling again. Thank you. All right. Listen, I really want to thank you all for coming out tonight to talk about the elections. This is part of the Eric Holder Initiative for Civil and Political Rights here at Columbia College, at Columbia University in New York City. And we are thrilled at the level of conversation that we can have. Thanks to you, Donna Brazile, thank you, Neal, Katyal, thank you, Michael Steele, thank you. And of course, Eric Holder, thanks for joining us again. It's been a real pleasure, and I suppose we're gonna stop now, and all of us can quickly return to our news feeds, right?
Yeah, right.
Count
Thank
every
you very
vote.
much.
Count every vote.
Count every vote.
All right, count every vote. Yeah, every vote counts. All right, thank you so much, everyone.